George stood at the edge of his breaking point. Hovering in the expansive, dimly lit hallway of his luxurious Chicago mansion, he stared through the slightly ajar door of the nursery, witnessing a heartbreaking scene that had relentlessly repeated itself every single day for the past 3 weeks. Lily, his beautiful 7-month-old daughter, was sobbing uncontrollably in her designer crib, releasing a desperate, piercing wail that seemingly sliced right through her father's weary soul. This was not the ordinary fussy crying of a tired infant. It was something profoundly different, echoing a deep, invisible agony that nobody in the massive house could decipher or soothe. He ran a trembling hand through his disheveled hair and took a long, shaky breath, feeling the heavy burden of his utter helplessness. As a self-made millionaire who confidently commanded one of the largest real estate construction empires in the United States of America, George was entirely accustomed to solving complex problems with a single phone call, yet standing before this tiny defenseless baby, he felt completely and utterly lost in a sea of despair. The hot tears streamed continuously down Lily's flushed, reddened face as she kicked her little legs and flailed her fragile arms desperately, trying to find some semblance of comfort on her own. George cautiously approached the crib, his heart aching with every step, and gently reached out his strong hands to lift her into his warm embrace. The very second his skin made contact with hers, the volume and intensity of her crying amplified drastically, as if even the comforting touch of her own father was incapable of providing the solace she so desperately craved. He gently rocked her back and forth, whispering soothing words into the quiet room, but the baby remained entirely inconsolable, her tiny face contorted in absolute suffering. George felt his chest tighten painfully as the haunting memories flooded his exhausted mind. Ever since Audrey had inexplicably vanished, their precious baby had not experienced a single day of peace. The agonizing recollection of his beloved wife's sudden departure still burned within him like a freshly opened wound, constantly reminding him of the mysterious void she had carelessly left behind in their once perfect urban life. It had all happened on what seemed like a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning, shortly after Lily had celebrated her 4-month milestone. George had descended the grand staircase to grab his morning coffee, only to find a devastating handwritten letter resting ominously on the expansive marble kitchen island. The incredibly brief note contained words that he had subsequently read 100 times, desperately trying to extract some hidden meaning. She claimed she could no longer live a lie, that she could no longer pretend everything was fine, and that Lily would be vastly better off without her. What lie was she talking about? Audrey had been the most fiercely dedicated, loving mother during those initial 4 months, happily waking up in the dead of night to nurse their child and softly singing sweet lullabies until dawn. He had frantically contacted every single friend, scoured the city, and even hired professionals, but it was as if Audrey had simply evaporated into the thin, cold air of Chicago, taking all the answers with her and leaving behind a continuously weeping infant. Driven to the absolute brink of his sanity, George aggressively utilized his massive wealth to hire an endless sequence of the most highly recommended specialized nannies the city had to offer. First came Mary, a seasoned professional, who proudly boasted about caring for dozens of affluent infants throughout her prestigious 40 years of experience, only to abruptly quit after a mere 2 days. She told George with a deeply unsettled look in her wise eyes that the baby was experiencing something dark and invisible, something that made the child stare at her with an eerie, knowing gaze. Next was Claire, a highly educated young woman boasting multiple degrees in early childhood development, armed with an arsenal of modern psychological techniques and theories. Despite trying countless different pacifiers, classical music therapy, and specialized baby massages, Claire completely failed. Lily cried even louder in her presence. Refusing to sleep for the entire 2 weeks Claire was employed, Claire finally left solemnly warning George that the baby was reacting to a specific non-physical trigger, desperately searching the room for a very particular presence that simply was not there. The third professional caregiver lasted only 5 days, and the fourth astonishingly quit after just 3 days, all of them arriving with unwavering confidence and departing with utterly shattered spirits. It was shortly after the disastrous departure of the fifth nanny that George made a decisive, slightly paranoid choice that would unknowingly alter the trajectory of his entire existence. Sitting alone in his cavernous home office, listening to the relentless, agonizing cries echoing through the ventilation system, he contacted an elite private security firm and demanded the immediate installation of a comprehensive state-of-the-art surveillance system. He ordered them to place completely hidden, highly discreet cameras in every single room of the sprawling mansion, specifically focusing on the nursery and the employee quarters. He was not trying to be a malicious employer. He was merely a terrified, desperate father, grasping at straws, hoping that if highly trained childcare professionals could not identify the root of his daughter's misery, perhaps the unblinking objective eyes of the hidden lenses might finally reveal the invisible tormentor hiding in the shadows of his home. The secretive installation occurred on the exact same afternoon George carefully transported Lily to an urgent appointment with Dr. Smith, the highly respected, affluent pediatrician who had diligently monitored the child since the very day she was born. After a meticulously thorough physical examination, the silver-haired doctor gravely informed George that the baby was in perfect physiological health, suggesting instead that the incredibly sensitive infant was emotionally absorbing George's own intense grief and unresolved trauma over his missing wife. Returning to his now fully monitored fortress, George felt even more isolated and confused, clutching his crying daughter as he stared blankly at his computer screen. In a sudden burst of desperate inspiration, completely abandoning his preference for elite professionals, he hastily drafted and published a simple classified advertisement in the local newspaper. He specifically requested a humble, straightforward housekeeper with entirely basic cleaning experience who could occasionally assist with a 7-month-old baby, offering a salary significantly above the market average. He silently prayed that perhaps someone entirely unburdened by fancy degrees and rigid psychological theories could finally provide the pure, uncomplicated, genuine affection his deeply broken daughter so desperately required. George was sitting in his luxurious office, trying desperately to focus on a complicated financial spreadsheet, when the heavy oak front door's chime echoed through the silent corridors. It was exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the precise time he had hurriedly arranged for the very first housekeeping interview of the day. He nervously saved his extensive documents, took a deep, steadying breath, and walked down the grand staircase, while awkwardly balancing the perpetually weeping Lily in his tired arms. Standing nervously on the pristine front porch was a remarkably plain-looking woman, appearing to be in her early 30s, wearing a faded, modest blouse and her brown hair pulled back into a simple, unadorned ponytail. However, it was not her humble attire that instantly captured George's immediate attention. It was the incredibly intense, almost piercing quality of her dark eyes. The very moment her gaze locked onto the tear-streaked face of little Lily, the mysterious woman completely froze in place, her worn hands beginning to tremble violently, as if she had just seen a ghost from her distant past. George immediately asked if she was feeling unwell, genuinely concerned by her intense, breathless reaction right on his front doorstep. The woman blinked rapidly several times, seemingly forcing herself back into the present reality, and introduced herself in a thick, emotion-laced voice, as Chloe apologizing profusely while whispering that the baby was simply too beautiful for words. He cautiously invited her inside to discuss the open position, but he quickly noticed that Chloe's teary eyes absolutely refused to leave the tiny infant, completely ignoring the opulent artwork and towering ceilings of the Chicago mansion. When George politely inquired about her previous cleaning experience, Chloe rapidly confirmed she had plenty, but she immediately offered to start working that exact moment without even asking a single question about her expected salary, her specific duties, or her working conditions. She declared, with an unusual, desperate intensity, that she would happily accept whatever minimal amount of money he offered, and that she possessed a completely wide-open schedule. Finding her overwhelming eagerness incredibly bizarre yet somewhat intriguing, George gently probed her further, asking why she was so incredibly desperate to secure this specific demanding job in his home. Chloe finally managed to tear her gaze away from the baby and looked George directly in the eyes, stating with raw, unfiltered honesty that she simply needed to work, and more importantly, she deeply loved caring for infants. She passionately promised to watch over the child during nights, weekends, and strict holidays, shockingly insisting that she would absolutely never charge him any extra money for the additional hours of childcare. As George stood there frowning in utter disbelief at her wildly unusual proposition, something absolutely miraculous and completely unexplainable occurred right before his tired eyes. Lily, who had been maintaining a steady, agonizing wail against George's chest for hours, suddenly fell completely and utterly silent, her massive, curious eyes locking firmly onto Chloe's face with intense fascination. The sudden heavy silence in the grand foyer was so absolute and shocking that both adults visibly jumped, completely taken aback by the unprecedented cessation of the infant's endless crying. Chloe took a slow, deliberate step forward, her trembling hands gently outstretched toward the baby, silently asking for permission to hold the fragile child in her arms. George hesitated for a brief, agonizing second, but seeing his daughter calm for the very first time in 3 weeks, overrode all of his logical, protective instincts. He carefully transferred the tiny girl into the housekeeper's waiting arms, entirely unprepared for the magical, heartwarming reaction that immediately followed the gentle exchange. Lily did not just remain quietly peaceful. She actively began to make adorable, joyful little cooing sounds, gifting the strange woman with a massive, genuinely ecstatic smile while reaching her tiny fingers out to affectionately grab at Chloe's jawline. Chloe instinctively cradled the baby with a jaw-dropping level of natural perfection, perfectly supporting Lily's back, and resting the small head against her left shoulder, exactly the highly specific way the baby always preferred to be held. When George, completely dumbfounded, asked how she possibly knew that incredibly specific holding technique, Chloe simply smiled mysteriously and softly credited it to basic feminine intuition, a vague answer that did not entirely satisfy the businessman. Realizing the unbelievable value of the piece she had just brought into his home, George hired her on the spot, completely ignoring all standard background checks and formal employment protocols. Deciding to quietly test this mysterious savior, George smoothly lied about needing to make urgent corporate phone calls and retreated to his private office, asking Chloe to watch the baby alone for an hour. As soon as the heavy office door clicked shut, George frantically pulled out his private smartphone and aggressively launched the hidden surveillance application to closely monitor every single move the new employee made. What George witnessed through the high-definition hidden cameras left him entirely paralyzed, with a mixture of profound awe and escalating, chilling suspicion. Chloe confidently carried Lily into the nursery and began flawlessly organizing the room instinctively, knowing exactly which specific drawers contained the preferred diapers, the correct hypoallergenic wipes, and the exact spare outfits, without ever needing to search. More disturbingly, Chloe reached up to a high, completely hidden shelf and retrieved a specific wind-up musical toy that George knew for an absolute fact he had never ever mentioned to her or anyone else. She gently cranked the toy, filling the room with the exact same obscure lullaby that Audrey used to sing softly to her pregnant belly, during the long, cold Chicago winter nights. Through the audio feed, George heard Chloe whispering to the now deeply asleep baby, promising the child that she was finally completely safe. George sat frozen in his leather chair, a cold wave of dread washing over him as he wondered what entirely unknown dangers this stranger believed she was protecting his daughter from. George woke up early the following morning feeling completely disoriented, having just experienced 8 straight hours of uninterrupted, deeply restorative sleep for the very first time since his beloved Audrey had vanished into the night. The massive house was draped in a serene, almost unnatural silence, a stark and incredibly welcome contrast to the agonizing continuous wails that had heavily plagued his existence for the past 3 weeks. He quietly crept down the hallway to peek into the beautifully decorated nursery, discovering his precious Lily still sleeping soundly in her crib, her tiny, delicate face radiating a profound, undisturbed peace that brought tears of pure relief to his tired eyes. Precisely at 8 o'clock in the morning, the heavy front doorbell rang, and George eagerly rushed to open it, holding the now awake but remarkably calm baby tightly against his chest. Chloe stood on the grand porch, offering a polite morning greeting, but her intense, loving gaze instantly locked onto the baby, entirely ignoring the wealthy businessman standing right in front of her. The absolute second Lily's bright eyes recognized the humble housekeeper, the baby let out a loud, joyful squeal, wildly kicking her little legs and waving her chubby arms in pure, unadulterated excitement. George willingly handed his daughter over, watching in sheer amazement as Chloe naturally settled the baby onto her hip. And then he promptly retreated to his upstairs office, under the convenient guise of managing urgent corporate matters. Once safely behind his locked door, he immediately activated the hidden surveillance cameras on his phone, intensely determined to carefully analyze every single microscopic interaction between this baffling stranger and his child. Through the crystal-clear screen, he watched Chloe carry the baby straight into the sprawling kitchen to casually prepare a morning bottle, her movements entirely confident and completely devoid of any hesitation. Without opening a single incorrect cabinet, she reached directly for the exact brand of formula Lily tolerated, selected the baby's absolute favorite purple bottle from a hidden rack, and flawlessly prepared the mixture. George felt a sudden icy chill cascade rapidly down his spine when he watched Chloe carefully test the temperature of the warm milk against the sensitive skin of her inner wrist. It was an incredibly distinct, uniquely specific physical gesture, a highly personalized movement executed in the exact same rhythmic, careful manner that Audrey had always used before feeding their daughter. As Lily greedily drank the entire bottle without a single fuss, a miraculous feat that none of the highly trained, expensive nannies could ever achieve. George pushed the volume button on his phone to the maximum limit. Through the tiny speaker, he clearly heard Chloe softly whispering to the feeding infant, tenderly asking the baby if she had missed her, and stating matter-of-factly that she knew the intelligent baby had instantly recognized her the previous afternoon. George's heart began to hammer wildly against his ribs. Chloe spoke with the deep, profound familiarity of a lifelong family member, not a desperate housekeeper who had merely been hired less than 24 hours ago. The bizarre revelations continued to aggressively pile up as the long morning progressed, pushing George closer and closer to the very edge of full-blown paranoia. While preparing a mid-morning snack, Chloe effortlessly mixed mashed bananas and sweet apples in the exact highly specific mathematical proportion that Audrey had painstakingly discovered after months of frustrating trial and error. After gently wiping the baby's messy face with an incredibly tender practiced touch, Chloe cautiously pulled a worn leather wallet from her modest handbag, casting a quick paranoid glance around the seemingly empty kitchen. She carefully extracted a slightly faded photograph and held it up directly to Lily's face, speaking in a hushed, heavily emotional tone about how the person in the picture loved the baby more than life itself. George strained his eyes desperately against the glowing screen, trying to make out the image. But the angle was impossible. However, the baby's completely mesmerized, deeply focused reaction strongly indicated that she somehow recognized the mysterious face in the photo. Exactly. At 12 o'clock, the jarring ringtone of Chloe's mobile phone violently shattered the quiet peace of the kitchen, prompting the housekeeper to answer with a distinctly cautious, hushed voice. George pressed his phone tightly against his ear, his breath completely catching in his throat, as he eavesdropped on the secretive, highly alarming conversation echoing through his hidden microphones. Chloe quietly informed the unknown caller that the baby was perfectly healthy, mentioning that the child looked exactly identical to how they had previously discussed and confirming that the oblivious father still suspected absolutely nothing. The frantic housekeeper aggressively insisted to the person on the other end of the line that she simply could not maintain this elaborate, exhausting charade, forever stating firmly that the innocent child completely deserved to know the absolute truth. George felt his entire world violently spin out of control. The horrifying realization that his new miraculous housekeeper was actively involved in a deliberate, highly organized conspiracy targeting his completely fractured family left him completely breathless and utterly terrified. Determined to forcefully uncover the hidden truth, George smoothly lied to Chloe about needing to attend an urgent corporate meeting, deliberately leaving the massive house to observe her completely unchecked from the safety of his parked car down the street. Sitting in the sweltering heat of the vehicle, he watched the camera feed as Chloe boldly carried the baby directly into the highly restricted, entirely private master bedroom that George had once shared with his missing wife. Chloe sat comfortably on the edge of the large bed, retrieved the hidden photograph once again, and explicitly told the baby that her mother had truly loved her heavily, implying that Audrey's sudden departure was a forced tragedy rather than a selfish choice. The final, absolutely undeniable confirmation of Chloe's deceit occurred when she walked purposefully into the massive walk-in closet, completely ignoring the expensive suits, and directly pulled out a tiny, perfectly concealed key from a secret floorboard. George watched in sheer absolute horror as the supposed housekeeper used the hidden key to flawlessly unlock Audrey's highly secure, deeply personal memory box, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that Chloe possessed intimately dangerous knowledge of his ruined life. George aggressively slammed his car door shut and practically sprinted up the grand front steps of his mansion, his heart hammering a frantic, violent rhythm violently against his ribs. He forced himself to take a deep, stabilizing breath before turning the heavy brass doorknob, desperately attempting to mask the boiling rage and profound terror swirling wildly within his chaotic mind. Upon entering the sprawling living room, he encountered a scene of absolute domestic tranquility. Chloe was sitting comfortably on the expensive rug, softly reading a vibrant, colorful children's book to a deeply captivated, entirely joyful Lily. When George casually inquired about the specific origin of the unfamiliar book, Chloe smoothly lied, without missing a single beat, casually claiming she had brought it from her own humble apartment to entertain the child. George offered a tight, completely artificial smile, firmly informing her that he would be working late in his upstairs office, thereby intentionally giving himself the necessary time to aggressively launch a full-scale private investigation into the mysterious woman sitting on his floor. Once securely locked inside his office, George completely bypassed his corporate work and immediately dialed the highly confidential direct number of the elite private investigator he had previously retained to locate his missing wife. He urgently commanded the seasoned detective to drop every single other ongoing case and aggressively dig into the entire background, hidden family ties, and past employment history of a seemingly humble cleaner named Chloe. Returning his full, undivided attention to the live security feeds, George noticed Chloe casually engaging in a very specific, highly unusual game of peekaboo, utilizing a bizarre sequence of complex hand gestures. his blood instantly turned to solid ice. Those exact, highly idiosyncratic movements were completely unique to Audrey, a personal silly game his wife had completely invented during the incredibly difficult sleepless nights of Lily's earliest weeks. George frantically pushed the volume to the absolute maximum, listening in sheer disbelief, as Chloe softly whispered to the baby that she had personally been there joyfully watching when the infant first kicked inside her mother's pregnant belly. Unable to tolerate the agonizing deception for a single second longer, George furiously stormed down the grand staircase, intentionally making heavy, loud footsteps to clearly announce his incredibly aggressive approach. He stormed directly into the living room, completely ignoring pleasantries, and sternly demanded to know exactly how a completely random, freshly hired cleaner possessed a highly personal, deeply intimate photograph of his heavily pregnant wife hidden away inside her wallet. Chloe's face instantly drained of all color, her eyes widening in absolute undeniable panic, as she instinctively pulled the completely oblivious happy baby closer to her chest in a deeply protective, highly defensive maternal gesture. She stammered nervously for a few agonizing seconds, desperately attempting to deflect the aggressive interrogation by vaguely philosophizing about how all complex families harbor deep, painful secrets that are sometimes necessary for survival. George viciously cut her off, his voice echoing loudly off the high ceilings, absolutely demanding to know her exact true connection to his missing wife, forcefully threatening to call the Chicago police if she continued to lie to his face. Seeing the absolute unyielding determination burning intensely in George's furious eyes, Chloe finally let out a long, shuddering sigh of utter defeat, gently placing the baby down onto the soft, padded playmat. She slowly stood up, looking the wealthy businessman directly in his eyes, and softly confessed the incredibly shocking truth: she was not merely a random friend or a simple employee, but she was Audrey's exact identical twin sister. George stumbled backward, as if he had been physically struck, shaking his head in absolute denial. He had been married for years, and his wife had never once mentioned possessing any siblings, let alone a living, breathing, identical twin. Chloe sadly explained that they had been tragically deliberately separated at exactly 5 years old, completely torn apart by a highly corrupt adoption agency that intentionally placed Audrey into extreme, unbelievable wealth and forced Chloe into a life of absolute grinding poverty. Audrey had been strictly forbidden by her adoptive status-obsessed parents from ever mentioning her impoverished twin, but the sisters had secretly, desperately maintained a hidden loving connection throughout their entire, completely disparate adult lives. The horrifying revelations did not stop there. Chloe explained with absolute chilling clarity that their devastating childhood separation was not a random tragedy, but rather a highly calculated, malicious scheme, orchestrated by extremely dangerous, powerful people. These individuals had intentionally manipulated their lives, planning to eventually pit the incredibly wealthy sister against the fiercely desperate poor sister in a complex, high-stakes game of corporate blackmail and ultimate financial destruction. George listened in absolute paralyzed horror as Chloe calmly revealed that his entire massive real estate empire had been initially funded by extremely dirty, untraceable money, completely controlled by this exact same invisible, highly dangerous criminal syndicate. Audrey's entire marriage to George was never a beautiful coincidence. She had been forcefully instructed by these powerful criminals to purposefully infiltrate his life, wait for the company to become massively successful, and then suddenly destroy him from the inside out. However, the syndicate's brilliant, foolproof plan completely unraveled because of one highly unpredictable, incredibly human element. Audrey had actually fallen deeply, madly, and unconditionally in love with the kind, hard-working man she was supposed to utterly ruin. When their beautiful daughter was finally born, The overwhelming, fierce power of true maternal love completely shattered Audrey's fearful obedience. She absolutely refused to plant the fake, highly damaging financial evidence that would send her innocent husband to federal prison. In vicious retaliation, the shadowy syndicate explicitly violently threatened to permanently take Lily away, forcing a completely terrified Audrey to stage a sudden disappearance in a desperate, deeply sacrificing attempt to keep her beloved family entirely safe from their wrath. Chloe had bravely infiltrated his heavily monitored home, not merely to comfort her suffering, crying niece, but to successfully execute a highly dangerous, extremely urgent rescue mission before the syndicate could finally make their devastating, violent move against the innocent baby. George completely collapsed into the plush leather armchair, his mind violently spinning as he desperately tried to process the massive, earth-shattering reality that his entire perfect life was nothing more than a carefully constructed, highly manipulated illusion. While holding the now quietly sleeping baby tightly against his rapidly beating chest, he begged Chloe to finally reveal the true hidden identity of the powerful mastermind who was actively controlling this entire, terrifying, invisible conspiracy. Chloe took a deep, deeply trembling breath, looking at him with profound, absolute pity, before completely shattering his world by naming Dr. Smith the highly respected, incredibly affluent pediatrician whom George had trusted explicitly with his daughter's fragile life. George immediately burst into nervous, highly frantic laughter, vehemently denying the absolute absurdity of the accusation, strongly insisting that the gentle, silver-haired doctor was a pillar of the Chicago medical community and a deeply devoted family man. Chloe quickly shattered his denial, firmly pointing out that George had never actually met the doctor's supposed family, nor had he ever questioned how the physician miraculously knew every single intimate detail of the baby's constantly fluctuating health. The horrifying puzzle pieces rapidly began to forcefully snap together in George's mind. He vividly remembered how the previous highly recommended nannies had constantly asked highly intrusive, deeply personal questions regarding his corporate finances and daily routines. Chloe carefully explained that almost every single nanny he had desperately hired was actually a highly paid, deeply loyal informant, strictly ordered to continuously report every microscopic detail of the family's vulnerable state directly back to the corrupt pediatrician. Dr. Smith had deliberately meticulously constructed a highly extensive, completely falsified medical history for the infant, continually ordering completely unnecessary, highly expensive medical tests to quietly build a devastating legal case against George's fundamental parental competence. This fake medical trail was specifically designed to be the ultimate devastating weapon. If George ever attempted to flee the city with the child, the doctor would legally, effortlessly prove him to be a highly negligent, medically abusive father. The ultimate breaking point for Audrey had occurred completely by chance during a routine mid-afternoon checkup, just a mere 3 days before she completely vanished into the chaotic, unforgiving streets of the massive city. While nervously waiting in the private examination room, Audrey had accidentally overheard the supposedly gentle doctor speaking on his private phone, coldly confirming to a shadowy associate that the target was entirely ready for the final devastating destruction phase. When Audrey returned to her supposedly safe home that afternoon, in a state of absolute sheer panic, she found the corrupt doctor already casually sitting in her pristine living room, coldly presenting her with a devastating, impossible ultimatum. He explicitly ordered her to entirely abandon her innocent husband and immediately disappear heavily, threatening that if she ever uttered a single word of warning, he would personally ensure that her precious baby suffered an extremely tragic, entirely untraceable medical accident. George felt a completely overwhelming, deeply nauseating wave of pure, unadulterated fury violently crash through his entire body when Chloe casually revealed the absolute darkest, most evil secret of the entire terrifying conspiracy. the endless agonizing wailing that Lily had suffered through over the past 3 weeks was not a natural reaction to her missing mother. The corrupt doctor had deliberately given the baby a highly specific, totally invisible poison during that final appointment. This continuous low-grade physical torture was intentionally designed to drive George into a state of absolute total desperation, ensuring he would blindly accept any strange help that arrived, thereby flawlessly paving the way for the syndicate's informants to enter. Chloe confidently explained that she had immediately recognized the specific symptoms and had secretly mixed a highly effective, completely safe chemical antidote into the very first bottle of formula she had prepared, instantly curing the child's agonizing continuous pain. Suddenly, Chloe glanced frantically at the large antique clock resting on the mantelpiece, her previously calm face twisting into an expression of sheer absolute terror, as she aggressively commanded George to immediately grab essential supplies. She urgently explained that they had significantly less than 2 hours to completely evacuate the highly monitored mansion, entirely because the corrupt doctor had recently discovered that the identical twin sister had successfully infiltrated the operation. Dr. Smith was currently en route to the property with a fully equipped, entirely fake medical team, aggressively planning to legally abduct the baby under the entirely false, highly fabricated pretense of a severe, life-threatening medical emergency. Exactly at 6 o'clock in the evening, the heavy front doorbell rang with a highly aggressive, incredibly persistent urgency, sending a massive, violent shockwave of pure adrenaline directly through George's completely paralyzed, deeply terrified body. George escaped through the back of the house with the sleeping baby, just as armed intruders broke through the front door. Chloe drove them hundreds of miles to a secure farmhouse hidden in rural Illinois, revealing during the journey that George's trusted friend Robert had first betrayed him, but later switched sides to help save the child. At the farmhouse, Audrey tearfully reunited with George and their baby, while Chloe introduced Martha, a former military operative who protected the property. Audrey apologized for leaving, explaining she had believed sacrificing her own happiness was the only way to keep her family safe from the criminal syndicate. Chloe then revealed that as a federal investigator, she had already delivered overwhelming audio recordings and corporate documents to the authorities. Federal agents were simultaneously raiding every clinic and office connected to the syndicate, dismantling the organization for good. Robert had supplied the final piece of evidence in exchange for immunity, bringing the nightmare to an end. Ignoring the legal details, George assured Audrey that he did not care about the manipulated circumstances that had brought them together, because their love and their daughter were genuine. He forgave the past, welcomed Chloe into the family, and promised Audrey they would never hide painful secrets from each other again. As Audrey, Chloe, and the baby shared a peaceful moment together, George finally felt the peace that had long been missing from his life. Audrey admitted that her greatest regret was failing to trust the strength of George's love when danger first threatened them. Watching the sunrise over the quiet countryside, George realized that a true family is not defined by bloodlines or perfect beginnings, but by unconditional love, trust, sacrifice, and the daily choice to stand together. Their painful journey proved that hope can emerge from betrayal, unexpected people can become heroes, and genuine love can overcome even the darkest manipulation, transforming tragedy into an unbreakable legacy of hope.